Welcome back to Celebrity Radio. It's Alex Belfield talking to some of the world's biggest stars, some of my favourite people, and people who have changed the world with their journalism, with their books, and with their honesty. A man who I've been fascinated by for many years is called Andrew Morton. He's got a brand new book out called 17 Carnations, the Royals, the Nazis, and the Biggest Cover-Up in History. I want to talk about you if we can, because there you are, a Dewsbury boy, just being a journo at the Mail and other places, doing what you do, and then you go to become one of the most prolific, one of the most respected, one of the most controversial writers in history. It's an amazing trajectory that you had, and the people that you've written about, probably most famously Diana. Did you ever think you'd become this, or did you think you'd just be one of those typewriter journos that's writing stories day in and day out for the newspapers?
Well, I started off in journalism. I worked for what's called the Mirror Group training scheme down in the West Country, and then I worked as both a sub-editor and a reporter in Manchester and in London. And I was asked to become the royal correspondent of the newspaper I was working for. And I knew nothing about the royal family. I knew that you spent the spelling of Prince Philip, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And I found myself within a matter of weeks on a plane to the island of Mustique in the Caribbean, chasing Prince Andrew and a girl called Koo Stark, who was at the time billed as a soft porn actress. They'd gone under the married name of Mr. and Mrs. Cambridge. He'd just come back from the Falklands as the hero of the Falklands War. Everybody thought they'd got married, and it was hysteria. And I realised that this was the most fun you could have with your clothes on. But at the same time, I wrote my first book then. Andrew the Playboy Prince, which was described by one newspaper as the worst book ever written. We'll let that one pass. But writing that book anyway gave me an appetite for actually writing longer form works, and I started writing royal books. I wrote the first story about Sarah Ferguson, her romance with Prince Andrew, and then subsequently wrote her biography, wrote various other royal books, and got quite familiar with the royal scene and started to build up a lot of contacts. And then in the mid-1980s, I went freelance and started working for myself.
It's certainly been an interesting year for Prince Andrew. Where does this leave him and his legacy in terms of the royal family and his position promoting the United Kingdom? Well,
certainly Prince Andrew has had an awful lot of bad publicity. Certainly his relationships with some pretty unsavoury politicians. And also an unsavoury American who's the sex scandal surrounding him. I've no plans to write any books about them, but they're certainly worth a profile at the moment, because what's going on is fascinating.
Do you think there are still shenanigans with the royal family? Have they learnt their lessons that you just can't get away with anything now, with social media, with email, with everything in a paper trail? You're so less likely to get away with it than you were before. You think they'd learn, wouldn't you?
I think actually they get away with an awful lot, quite frankly. I think that it's something of a chimera to think that just because you've got Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, that gives you access to the innermost thoughts and reaches of Buckingham Palace. In actual fact, I would argue that the royal family is more secretive today than it was before, because William and Harry and Kate have a pretty tight ship. William is very concerned about any publicity about him and his wife, and unlike previous generations, he will resort to the law to gag newspapers. So I would actually argue that unless they do something ridiculous that comes out they largely get away with things, and they live a relatively private life away from the royal engagements that they undertake.
I guess they are literally a law unto themselves, and that's what your new book is about. In terms of your body of work, which is the book you're most proud of? I mean, you've had some extraordinary successes. Obviously, we think of Tom Cruise and the Monica book, and Diana has to be your most famous. Which are you most proud of in terms of the legacy it will leave in history?
Well, when I die and somebody writes my obituary, the first sentence will be Princess Diana's biographer. So obviously that's a book that stands head and shoulders above anything else I've ever written and will ever write, because it was an extraordinary, unique book that with the active collaboration and cooperation of the subject, discussing things which had never been dealt with before. And you talked about, could the royal family get away with it? Well, they had been getting away with it for years, because everybody, until my book came out, believed in the fairy tale of Charles and Diana. In fact, that's what the world believed in. And I was like the character out of a Hans Christian Andersen story, saying, well, the emperor's got no clothes. So to that extent, that book is by far and away the book that I'm proudest of, because the actual mechanism of doing it was very complicated and needed a lot of thought.
From what we've discussed in the last 20 minutes, it sounds perfectly feasible that in 20 years you could write another book about a current royal that appears to be happy that possibly isn't. I mean, is it still that much smoke and mirrors in the royal family that is possible?
Well, let's just look at Catherine Middleton for a moment. She seems a very decent, pleasant girl, but she's been put into this extraordinary position as the future queen, as a commoner. Parents, decent, middle class people from the green acres of Berkshire. What do we really know about the inner workings of her heart, her head, the calculations that she's had to undertake, going from St Andrews University to the place that she occupies now? What role of her mother, Carol, her father? What discussions have taken place behind closed doors? What rows and so on? I'm sure there's an awful lot there that we know nothing about, because they've all remained extremely tight-lipped.
Your description sounds reminiscent of a young Diana, doesn't it?
Well, exactly. Because she's gone through the same trajectory. And that's what makes people interesting. What's the trajectory of her life from being an obscure middle-class girl that you wouldn't look twice at in the street, apart from the fact that she's quite a pretty girl, to someone who's now seen as a saviour of the royal family, a pin-up, an international character, someone. So, what does it do to her as a person? And she's undergone 2 very difficult pregnancies, as we all know, and there's all the pressures of that and the pressures to perform. How has she, coped with it all?
It's a fascinating life you've had. I always, when I read your books, wonder what you didn't put in. I think that could be a book in itself, how much doesn't get through the lawyers. Your mind must be fascinating. You could start a conference, couldn't you really, Andrew?
Yeah, I could start a conference.
I think the last person I asked this question to was Piers Morgan, but did you ever have a moment of fear when you worried you'd gone too far with any of your books or anything you'd written within those books?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. With the Diana book, it was terrifying, because you knew that you were going to be cut to pieces by the establishment, and you knew that everything had to be accurate, and you knew that everybody who had spoken to me had to stand by what they'd said, because it had to be absolutely watertight, otherwise you'd be sunk, literally.
Did you ever fear that the establishment or somebody bigger than yourself could wipe you out just to shut you up?
Well, there was always that fear. I mean, during the research for the book, my office was broke. I was warned by a couple of journalists that Buckingham Palace were on my trail, and that the police had been called in to find out who were my contacts. Then a few weeks later, my office was broken into, and all the files gone through, camera stolen. Who did it? No clue. But it was an interesting confluence of events. In fact, funny enough, when I did a book on Tom Cruise, some guy in Los Angeles said to me, "Do you want a piece?" I said, "A piece of what?" He said, "A piece." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "A gun." I said, "No, to look after yourself. Scientologists come after you."
How very American. What's next? Where do you go from now? We've had the Nazis, the Royals, we've had Tom Cruise, we've had Diana. Who's next?
Well, I've uncovered some quite interesting material about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, which I'm going to explore over the next few months, because it's led me down a track which could actually reveal a lot more about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor than perhaps is known at the moment.
A man who I've been fascinated by for many years is called Andrew Morton. He's got a brand new book out called 17 Carnations, the Royals, the Nazis and the Biggest Cover-Up in History. That's quite a title, Andrew. Congratulations, you've got me curious.
Thank you, yes. It's a title that kind of emerged out of the copy, because I did realise that when I looked at the evidence that, yes, indeed, there was a file on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and their relationship with the Nazi Party, which not only Winston Churchill, but Dwight Eisenhower, the President of America.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's been an ongoing gag for years about the royal family and the Nazis, but what you've done have been the first person to really research this and almost prove it. I mean, it's worrying in one way, fascinating at the very least. Why did you decide to spend so much time on this? Because it's been 3 years of your life, hasn't it?
Yes, it has been 3 years. I was intrigued about this story a few years ago. I read just a little snippet in a book about a metal canister that had been dug up from a German estate, and inside the canister was microfilm relating to the German Foreign Office, and this was manna from heaven for the Allies, because it was all about Ribbentrop, the German Foreign Minister, Molotov, the Russian Foreign Minister, Franco, Mussolini, and all these characters. And so the Allies saw this as a heaven-sent opportunity to prove to the world that the Nazis and the Axis powers had actually started the war, planned the war, and that the sacrifice had not been in vain. And yet, when they opened the file and dug a bit further, they discovered these documents relating to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And they were absolutely shocked by it, because it showed that, certainly according to the German ambassadors to Lisbon and to Madrid, the Duke and Duchess had been in cahoots with the Nazis. He talked openly about going, if he'd been on the throne, the war had never happened. He talked openly about bombing of British cities to bring England into subjugation. But also he'd made sly and secret contact with the Nazis at a time when they were trying to plot to make Edward VIII the puppet king of England once they'd invaded. And this was an operation called Operation Willie. And yet the Duke, unbeknownst to the Duke, he was in contact with the Nazis anyway about looking after his homes in Paris and in the south of France. And more than that, he asked them to look after his possessions, especially their fine linen. Now, here was a man who, just a few years before, had been the head of Britain, of the apex of British society as king, but also he was extremely disloyal to his brother, not just to his country. The King George VI, he was saying that he was very stupid, that the Queen, later the Queen Mother, was conniving. So he was extremely disloyal, and if this information had come out at the time in 1945, it would have put a bomb under Buckingham Palace.
Where do they go from here? Do they just ignore it? Do they acknowledge it? Do they deny it? Do they try and defend it? Where do they go?
Well, King George VI did acknowledge it. He was very concerned about it, and remember, he'd fallen out with his brother over the abdication, and his brother didn't have any kind of status in Britain. He was effectively exiled, but at the same time, he was very concerned about the possible damage to the monarchy, and so was Churchill, and so were many other British politicians who knew about this, and there was a concerted campaign to destroy this file, but it was the Americans who said, well, hang on, this is history. This is a bit of history, and you've got to publish it at some point. And they spent 12 years trying to kick it into the long grass, as it were. And it was only after 12 years that it was published. Now, so it was published in 1957, but at the time, it was hedged around with all kinds of caveats. There was a new reign. Queen Elizabeth II was on the throne, our present Queen. the Duke of Windsor by then was a far more marginal figure, and he was just seen as a playboy prince flitting from Palm Beach to Paris to the south of France. So, and also it was couched in terms that he was the victim of Nazi machinations, that he was the victim of a Nazi plot. Well, not so much. He was quite active in considering their offer. They'd offered him a castle in the south of Spain. They'd offered him 50 million Swiss francs. So they'd even sent their chief spy master, a man called Walter Schellenberg, out of Lisbon to kidnap him and his wife, Wallis Simpson, and bring them to Spain, where they would await the moment when they could be made the new King and Queen of England.
How has this been received in 2015 by the royal household and Buckingham Palace? Have they reacted yet?
They've not reacted yet, but I think that they will see that this is something that's been touched on over the years by various people, but never analysed properly.
Right.
And this is what I've done. This is why I spent years on this, going through all the documents which relate to it, and it does paint not a particularly edifying picture, quite frankly, of the British establishment, because they prevaricated, they tried to destroy the file, then they tried to delay the publication, and at the same time, George VI was sending his courtiers around Europe to pick up correspondence from Queen Victoria and from others, and obviously at the time saying to his courtiers, well, if you see anything about the Duke of Windsor, keep a weather eye out, because we need to keep that we need to bring that back to London for safekeeping.
Do you know what's amazing about your story? It's almost like exactly the same thing as going on with the government right now and the paedophile rings and the BBC and Savile cover-up. I mean, this is the same sort of thing, isn't it? Where these people think they're bigger than the truth, they're bigger than society and can cover it up. Eventually you get caught out. It seems unthinkable that at some point someone like you wouldn't discover this truth.
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, this episode shows that instinctively, the British establishment is deferential towards the monarchy. Instinctively, the British establishment goes for the blue pen to censor, whereas, generally speaking, the Americans tend to go towards disclosure. In this case, there was a degree of collusion between both sides, and it was only the activities of a couple of feisty American academics that stopped these papers from being destroyed. And you're absolutely right. There has been a culture of secrecy in Britain that has led to what's gone on at the BBC, certainly what's gone on with Savile, and this kind of cosy old boys network worked very effectively at this time that I'm describing, because what happened at the palace when they got to hear about it? Well, they went to MI5 and MI6 and asked them what they thought. So, they went down to their clubs on Pall Mall and had a little quiet chat.
It's extraordinary. The new book is out now. It's called 17 Carnations, The Royals, the Nazis, and the Biggest Cover-Up in History. When you read it, it's like fiction, but of course it's reality, and that's what's extraordinary about this story. It's the old saying, isn't it? You couldn't make this stuff up.
No, you can't make it. And what really intrigued me, first of all, was this extraordinary discovery in the first place, how this Scottish librarian who worked at the Foreign Office, an extraordinary chap called Robert Curry Thompson, worked part-time as a missionary during the interwar years, and also as a king's messenger delivering packages around Europe, built up a network of people that he knew. And he just so happened he met Hitler's second-in-command as a translator, who had actually disobeyed orders from the Nazi high command, because they said destroy all the documents, because obviously in the dying days of the Second World War, they were trying to cover up their tracks. And these archivists, to their great credit and courage, because the SS were ordered to force them to destroy these documents, they'd hidden them. And this guy had actually made a microfilm of the most secret documents and hidden it in this tin. And I thought to myself, well, this is a great opening for a film.
Incredible. And I'm sure it will be at some point, because it is almost unbelievable in places what you revealed. The final question on this is, were there points where you wondered whether this book would ever get published because you either A, couldn't prove or stand up what you'd found, or people tried to get in the way of the publication?
My primary publisher is American, and in America there's freedom of expression. In Britain, not so much. We have draconian laws that stop you from doing all kinds of things. Fortunately, in terms of the law, most of the people involved in this whole saga are dead, so you can't legally libel the dead. It was more a question of justifying the title, because it was a massive cover-up, and I was astonished myself, because initially I was also looking at the work of Anthony Blunt. Now, Anthony Blunt was a Soviet spy and a member of what's known as the Cambridge spy ring. He was also the surveyor of the King's pictures. He worked for George VI, and he was sent on an extraordinary mission himself to a castle in Germany to pick up these letters from Queen Victoria. And this has been a little escapade that has always been surrounded in intrigue, because many people have suspected that Blunt and his colleague, a man called Morshead, were sent there by George VI to pick up incriminating letters that the Duke of Windsor had sent to Hitler during the Second World War. Or he had sent those letters to the man who owned the castle, a guy called Prince Philip, not the husband of our present Queen. And so that little episode is one which has been the one that's made the headlines, but it's the other one, which I've earlier described, about discovering this microfilm in a tin hidden in a forest, that is a more extraordinary story.
Well, you've done it again, Andrew. Another book that's got people talking and thinking. That's what you do. The Royals, the Nazis, and the biggest cover-up in history is available now with Michael Amara Books. It's available on Amazon and other places. Really great to talk to you, Andrew Morton. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.